Welcome to The Secret Truth. I'm George Butler. To my right with me this afternoon in Dallas, Texas at the JFK Conference 2017 is Jim Fetzer. My gosh, I can't say a good enough introduction for Jim Fetzer. He's done so much in just the JFK assassination and a lot of other things. Welcome to our program, Jim Fetzer.
Thank you, George. It's a real pleasure to be with you again. I've had the benefit of collaborating with the best people to ever study the case, including a world authority on the human brain, who is also an expert on wound ballistics, a PhD in physics, who is also an MD and board certified in radiation oncology, which made him an expert in the interpretation of X-rays, a physician who was in trauma room number 1 when JFK's moribund body was brought in, and then 2 days later was responsible for the care and treatment of his alleged assassin. Another PhD in physics, this time with an expertise in electromagnetism, properties of light, and images of moving objects, and we've been able to discover, really shatter the cover-up, by discovering the autopsy X-rays were altered to conceal a fist-sized blowout to the back of the head, that someone else's brain was substituted for that of JFK, and that the Zapruder film has been massively edited and revised to conceal the true causes of death of our 35th president.
Well, I tell you, this has been a very unique conference, and we've got to give Judith Berry Baker a lot of credit. I think she's right over there, in fact, but she's organized and put together what you just spelled out there is phenomenal, is it not? Of speakers with insight into this JFK.
Judith's a wonderful person. Of course, she was Lee's girlfriend in New Orleans the summer before the assassination. She knew a great deal about him. There's been an effort to minimize her, to trivialize her knowledge, because she humanizes the man who's been made out by the government to be the lone demented assassin when he was nothing of the kind. In fact, he appears to have been recruited while he was in Marine Corps basic training in San Diego, where I would subsequently serve as a series commander with 15 DIs and 300 recruits under my command. He was stationed at Atsugi subsequently, which was our most highly classified base, where he was a radar operator near the altitude of the U-2 flights that were conducting surveillance over the Soviet Union, conducted a pseudo defection at behest of the CIA. In order to provide that information to the Soviets, who knew the overflights were taking place but not the altitude, and were unable to shoot it down. When a summit was about to take place between Eisenhower and Khrushchev accused the United States of spying on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower denied it, but Khrushchev at that point in time was able to produce the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, and parts of the U-2. Very embarrassing. So instead of a summit that was intended to reduce Cold War tensions, we had an increase by virtue of this embarrassing event. Lee would marry the daughter of a KGB colonel, return to the United States, and be welcomed not as any kind of traitor, but actually by a CIA front organization that gave him money to relocate. He wound up in New Orleans, while Marino wound up in Dallas. In fact, the family with which she stayed had contacts and were able to arrange for Lee, when he came to Dallas, to have a job at the book depository building, setting him up to play the role of a patsy. While he was in New Orleans, he participated in handing out flyers in support of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which is part of what's known as a sheep-dipping operation to create the false persona of a pro-communist Castro sympathizer that they would then use and exploit when they pegged him for the death of JFK.
Well, I tell you that Lee Harvey Oswald, then, was he not connected to the FBI and the CIA in different ways at different times?
Right. He was initially recruited by the Office of Naval Intelligence, which has been a black hole for releasing information. His pseudo-defection was at the bequest of the CIA, and as you're astutely observing, Wagner Carr, the Attorney General of Texas, launched an investigation in the wake of the assassination and discovered immediately that he was working as an informant for the CIA, that he had informant number 179, and that he was being paid $200 a month right up to the time of the assassination. which is why for years and years the government was unwilling to release his W-2 forms. I mean, a simple absurdity, George.
Did he inform on himself, Jim?
Yeah, a simple absurdity until they developed the technology where they could fake it and remove the $200 he was being paid, because otherwise it would be so revealing that he was an unlikely candidate to have performed an assassination. And of course, as you have seen here today, we have pursued a line of research that was initially initiated by Harold Weisberg in his Whitewash series, where Whitewash 2, Photographic Whitewash 1966, reported in the last few pages how the Warren Commission was working very hard with its staff to conceal that Lee Oswald had been in the doorway of the book depository when the motorcade came by. Jim Garrison himself, the celebrated district attorney who brought the lawsuit against Clay Shaw for involvement in the assassination, which he would no doubt have won had it not been for the unfortunate, not really mysterious deaths of his three key witnesses, also believed Lee was in the doorway. Ralph Sinkay, who is a chiropractor, emphasized to me years ago that the key to the identification was not the face, but the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, the t-shirt he was wearing, where by virtue of his background as a chiropractor, he was very used to working with people, developing their bodies so their clothes would fit properly, where it turned out that the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, the t-shirt were indistinguishable from the man they arrested at the Texas Theater. In fact, they made Lee remove his outer shirt, which was a very richly textured garment that had been made in the Soviet Union, made in Russia, which Marina would eventually acknowledge had Tatro. She'd actually laundered herself so that it wouldn't be so conspicuous that he was the man in the doorway caught in the famous photograph taken by James Ike Alchins, so that he was photographed for his mugshot in a t-shirt. Very, very strange. But the fact is that the Alchins photograph, which has been tampered with in many ways, has proven to be the key to the solution here, because not only did we have the isolation of Lee as the candidate who fit the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, and the t-shirt, unlike Billy Lovelady, his co-worker, who himself said he thought it was odd they'd be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter and 15 to 20 pounds lighter, actually substantially more heavy than Lee in that regard, who actually was interviewed by the FBI on the 29th of February 1964. They asked him to wear the shirt he'd been wearing at the time. He came in wearing a short sleeve, red and white vertically striped shirt. They photographed him in the shirt. They wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, including the photographs, that this was the man in the doorway, hoping he wouldn't notice that in no way, shape, or form could he have been the man they were most interested in, who appears to be leaning out. And what Larry has now done, in the wake of all of our further research on this subject, where I probably published 20 articles on different aspects of this part of the case, is to find suitable photographs that enable him to do overlays. So he's been able to prove through a series of computer generated GIFs that the man in the doorway also not only had the height, the weight, the build, the shirt, the t-shirt that Lee was wearing, but was indeed Lee Oswald, where the facial features fit exactly. And while those of Billy Lovelady do not, and where in addition he's been able to establish that Billy was standing beside Lee with his arms raised, his hands to protect his eyes from the sun, where we'd long since noticed that in this part of the Alchins that there were various photographic anomalies that indicated the photograph had been altered in this region, one being a figure known as Black Tie Man, who's both in front of and behind the doorman figure at the same time, meaning the doorman figure is missing his left shoulder, which of course is an anatomical absurdity. And
a little photoshopping, right?
It's a bit much, George. And in those days it wasn't very sophisticated, so what they did was very crude. But they also completely whited out the shirt that the man with his hands elevated was wearing because it was so conspicuous. But Larry has not only established that that was Billy Lovelady, that the doorman was Lee Oswald, but he's reconstructed what the image would have looked like had it been in color at the time, and it's really stunning work, which of course turns out to be the reason why, when they held this mock trial here in Houston, overlapping with the commencement of this conference. They excluded Larry Rivera as a witness because it would have been decisive. His proof would have left no doubt in anyone's mind. They would have had 5 minutes of deliberation and an acquittal of Lee Oswald for complicity in the crime, because given he was in the doorway, he obviously could not have been on the 6th floor shooting at JFK. He cannot have been the lone gunman or even one of the multiple assailants who fired at the president in Dealey Plaza that day.
My gosh, that's devastating. You also introduced earlier today a man did a statistical analysis, is that right?
Richard Charnon is a brilliant statistical analyst who's published a book, Reclaiming Science, about the improbability of the number of witnesses who have died odd deaths. Just as a purely statistical analysis, some were homicides, some were suicides, some were heart attacks, some were automobile accidents, and he just was using, a comparison with the normal rate of incidents with which those events would occur in a certain population. And I mean, the improbability of these deaths is simply staggering and overwhelming. He was initially intrigued by this problem when he watched the brilliant film Executive Action, which was released in 1973, starring Burt Lancaster as the very efficient manager who's assisting a figure with a striking resemblance to Clint Murchison Sr., where they're inducing a fellow they refer to as Harold, who's H.L. Hunt, to join them in taking John F. Kennedy out of office, where the film shows that Harold is initially hesitant, but that as the situation develops, they pile on more and more reasons why JFK needs to be taken out, including that he's going to cut the oil depletion allowance that is an immense tax write-off from which they all benefit. This is very, very well done about the Dallas aspects of the assassination, even though we know that, in fact, it originated when Lyndon Johnson forced himself onto the ticket in Los Angeles in 1960. He wasn't on Bobby or Jack's long list, much less their short. Jack had actually invited Stuart Symington of Missouri to join him on the ticket, but gave him overnight to think about it. When Bobby went by the Johnson suite with a pro forma offer, he never imagined Lyndon would show the least interest and was dumbfounded when he jumped on it. Using information provided by J. Edgar Hoover, he threatened to reveal that JFK had Addison's disease, wasn't expected to live a long, healthy life, that his dalliances with beautiful women had included some who were spies for East Germany. And moreover, he added that if he were not on the ticket, then any legislative proposal sent down by the White House would be dead on arrival, because he, as the powerful majority leader of the Senate, would bottle them up. Jack and Bobby tried to figure a way out of it, but they were boxed in by LBJ. When one of Lyndon's wealthy supporters learned he would be on the ticket with Jack, he burst into the Johnson suite cursing and swearing that now Lyndon would help JFK become president of the United States. Bobby Baker took him into a bedroom and explained what they had in mind. He came out all smiles and said he thought that was an excellent plan. Bobby would subsequently declare in public that JFK would not live out his first term and that he would die a violent death. Lyndon Johnson would subsequently send his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination.
Boy, I tell you, just the intrigue and the players and the involved individuals, this had to have the sanctions of the top elite in the world, Europe and America, did it not?
Well, it was a U.S. op.
It had to have some of the top money people in the world to help cover it up and keep it the cover-up going, I guess.
Well, the importance of the work that I have done is because it is scientific evidence that has shattered the cover-up by discovering, for example, that the autopsy x-rays were altered to conceal a fist-sized blowout to the back of the head, that someone else's brain had been substituted for that of JFK, that the Zapruder film had been massively edited and revised. In fact, I estimate that whereas what we have available today is 487 frames, that 100 frames were removed of the turn from Houston onto Elm because the driver, William Greer, swung out too widely, nearly hit a concrete abutment there, had to hesitate and pull back into line. That would have shaken the confidence of the public in the Secret Service ability to properly protect the president. In fact, that day we have more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit. But then there were, after shots had been fired, the driver, Greer again, of course, pulled the limousine to the left into a halt to make sure he would be killed. During that period of time, he was hit in the back of the head by a shot fired from the Dow Tex. He slumped forward. Jackie, as in back up, was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible or exploding bullet that set up shock waves that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium when they impacted Officer Bobby Hargis riding there. He initially thought he himself had been shot. What Larry Rivera has also discovered is interviews that were done by Fred Newcomb with the 4 motorcycle escort officers and their supervisor, Stavis Ellis, to fill in the gaps. Not only did they have to conceal that the limo had been brought to a halt, which was bad enough, that he'd been hit by 2 shots during that interval, but that Bobby Hargis had dismounted his bike. He'd run in between the 2 vehicles up toward the grassy knoll from which he believed the shots had been fired, that Officer Douglas Jackson on the opposite side motored up the grassy knoll until his bike fell over and then proceeded on foot, that 5 agents had dismounted the Secret Service Cadillac and surrounded the presidential limousine, that one of them had taken a chunk of skull from a little boy and thrown it in the back seat. Meanwhile, Clint Hill is rushing up to push Jackie back after climbing out on the trunk after a big chunk of Jack's skull and brains, which he held on her hand all the way to Parkland. Clint Hill lay across the bodies and was the first to peer up close and personal into this bloody, gaping, fist-sized hole in the back of JFK's head. Obviously a mortal error. In fact, he was dead instantly. Turned and gave his colleagues a thumb down. All of that had to be edited out. So as much as 400 additional frames have been removed to conceal all of that. They consolidated the 2 hits, but they made the mistake of leaving 1 frame from 312 to 313 where there's forward motion from the hit to the back of the head, which Josiah Thompson initially had analyzed in his book 6 Seconds in Dallas, published in 1967, which was the most scientific and important part of his book, such that when, as we were approaching the 50th observance, he began disavowing his own work, including its most important part, the double hit theory, I could tell he was setting himself up to renounce the existence of conspiracy in the assassination of JFK. David Lifton, however, meanwhile, had visited Caltech, where the world's most famous physicist, Richard Feynman, was on the faculty with blow-ups of the frames, and Feynman took a ruler and was able to establish independently that JFK had forward motion from 312 to 313 and then violent back into the left, which no one witnessed in Dealey Plaza. In fact, that violent back into the left was because of editing out too many frames. In fact, the camera was running at 24 frames per second, but they took out so many frames it came down to 18.3, which is totally anomalous. I mean, this is a new camera, and there's no reason that would have happened. And the fact is that it was all part of the concealment, which was done by the CIA at a secret lab adjacent to Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York, known as Hawkeye Works, where Lifton, again, was the first to sort it out, just as he discovered that they'd actually perform alteration to the body, including enlarging a simple, clean entry wound to the throat into a kind of grotesque-looking mess that might have been the result of an exit wound to the throat, and enlarging the fist-sized blowout to the back of the head, actually taking a cranial saw to the skull of JFK, but in front of 2 witnesses, believe it or not, one of whom was the mortician, Thomas Evan Robinson, who had prepared the body for the funeral, such that when the Assassination Records Review Board interviewed him and showed him this diagram by J. Thornton Boswell, who'd been assisting Humes with the autopsy, and this dotted line that was indicative of this large missing part of the back of the skull, he said, oh no, the doctors did that he had witnessed with an x-ray tech, the Humes take a saw to the skull to enlarge the wound so that he could claim that the bullet had entered at the base of the skull and come out the top of the skull to remove this huge chunk of the back of the brain, because JFK had been leaning so far forward in order to create a plausible pretext for explaining it as the effect of a shot from behind, which was, of course, a manifest absurdity, and where we now know, especially confirmed by Doug Horn's 5-volume Inside the ARRB, that in fact it was the same fist-sized blowout to the back of the head when the body arrived at Bethesda, but subsequently altered by Humes himself. It's a stunning story. I mean, it has so many nicks and crannies and twists and curves that it's hardly surprising ultimately that it's been so difficult to crack. I believe that it was because I brought together the best qualified experts to ever study the case, and we went back to reconstruct the medical evidence from the ground up, that we have been able to shatter the cover up and expose what actually happened, because once you separate the authentic from the inauthentic evidence, it's really very straightforward.
Well, that is very insightful and great research that you did on that opened up other researchers also, and I believe that C.D. Jackson was head of Time Life at the time, and they're the ones that acquired the Zapruder film. So I guess the alterations of it occurred in their possession, or? Well,
the actual alterations occurred over the weekend. The original was sent to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., where they would do blow-ups of these microscopic photographs taken by satellites in space. And that's what you need if you're going to alter a film, the capacity to blow it up so you could change it and then shrink it back down. The original was taken to the NPIC on Saturday, the 23rd, as an 8-millimeter already split film, where the camera functions on a 16-millimeter film, shoots down one half of it called side A, and then you flip it over and you shoot the other side. So it's a 16-millimeter split into two 8-millimeter, where in order to play the whole thing, you'd have to splice it together. And this film had been developed in Dallas. In fact, the NPIC didn't have an 8-millimeter projector, so they had to have a store owner open his shop in order to buy one to even view it. One team was working Saturday. A different team was working Sunday, when a 16-millimeter unsplit film was brought from Rochester by a Secret Service agent who identified himself as William Smith, and the exchange was made. Now, Time Life was buying the film on Saturday, but in fact it wasn't in their control until they actually got the copy of the edited version.
So they actually had an edited version by the time they got it?
That's right. I'm relatively convinced that by the time they had the film in their possession, it was already edited, but because it was so poorly done, even though they paid a staggering sum in terms of money, the value of dollars in those days, they never showed it. They never exploited it. They had what many would regard as the most historic footage in history, but they never exploited the fact that they, at that point in time, owned the film. And that was for a very good reason. I mean, Time Life was tied into the CIA.
Well, C.D. Jackson reported to be a CIA.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. In fact,
so that's why they kept it under-publicized or not published.
Carl Bernstein in 1977 published in Rolling Stone an article entitled "The CIA and the Media," in which he explained that officials of the agency were boasting that their greatest successes in infiltrating the American media had been with Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS. And in that era, if you controlled Time Life, the New York Times, and CBS, you pretty much had a lock on the American news media, which they've exploited. It's only become worse today. I refer to the New York Times as the Langley newsletter because it's so totally controlled by the CIA.
What would you say about the archives release? What is that going to do? I mean, actually, people like yourself and other researchers have pretty well figured out what happened before this release. Would you agree with that, or
yes?
Is that an accurate statement?
Yes. Well, it's typical of scholarly research that as you obtain more evidence, new evidence,
it confirms in your previous research.
Or disconfirms, and in this case it does appear to be confirming. I mean, among the recent releases,
your research is confirmed.
That's right, and it does appear to in some rather striking ways. I mean, Larry Rivera is mentioning to me how the release of a very substantial document over 200 pages in length that was outlining how they were going to portray Lee Oswald as having gone to Mexico without his having actually gone. We have long since known that the individual in photographs who was feigning to be Lee Oswald looked nothing like him. In fact, he appears to be someone named Walter Tabinski, who's associated with a crime family in Toronto, Canada. They have the audio tape, and again, it's not Oswald's voice, which led J. Edgar Hoover to issue a memorandum to his agents in charge that someone was in Mexico City impersonating Lee Oswald, which, in my opinion, if that's all you knew about the assassination, you'd understand it was a conspiracy and that he was being framed all by itself.
What was not the FBI put out a memo or whatever to their agents about these conspiracy nuts out here that were trying to get into convert the JFK into a conspiracy?
Well, they were trying to figure out how to deal with critics of the Warren Commission.
Yes, so they tried to misportray them.
In 1964, they issued a memorandum of what you might call talking points for their agents to debunk
that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Critics, to claim they had nothing new, that they were in it for self-aggrandizement, that they were trying to make money, that everything they were claiming had already been investigated and debunked. It was also introducing the phrase conspiracy theorist, so that it was
instead of subtle conspiracy nuts.
Right, it was a subtle shifting of the burden of proof that was intended to imply that unless a critic could explain everything that had happened in every detail, they ought not to be taken seriously, which of course is a complete reversal of the actual role from the point of view of logic. The critics were falsifying the official account by pointing out aspects in which it was clearly and provably wrong, such as, for example, the backyard photographs.
Oh man, that was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Right, and as you talk about Life magazine complicity, they put one of these photographs on the cover of Life magazine, which tied up the case in a single package, because the figure there, who certainly looks like Lee Oswald, is holding a Mannlicher Carcano. He's got a pistol belt with a revolver with which he's alleged to have shot Officer J.D. Tippit, and he's holding two communist newspapers, The Worker and The Militant. So what they're tying together in the package is a motive and means, and of course, since he was working at the book depository, he had the opportunity. Except that, we've had legendary analysts such as Jack White pointing out that the chin is not Oswald's chin, that there's an insert line between the chin and the lower lip. Lee himself said it was his face pasted on someone else's body, and that with time he'd be able to prove it because he knew something about photography. Well, we've been able to carry that out, even though he was unable to do it himself. The fingertips of the right hand are cut off. The newspapers, if they're used as a standard to determine the height of the individual, as Jack White discerned could be done, lay him off from the bottom of the sole of his foot to the top of his head. Turns out to be too short to be Lee Oswald, only 5'6", whereas Lee was approximately 5'10", which meant either they used someone who was too short to be Lee, or what actually happened, they put the newspapers in a little too large when they fabricated the photograph.
The head was cockeyed too much. It wasn't put onto the shoulders or neck, and it was off a little bit. That's what I spotted immediately when I first saw it.
You have
it was cockeyed a little bit.
You have these four different photographs, and the face is exactly the same in all four of these photographs, which is an optical impossibility given they're taken at different times and in different positions. But in addition, we have discovered, Jim Mars and I dedicated my presentation to Jim Mars.
Well, you and him worked together closely.
Well, we did. We authored an article, The Framing of the Patsy, the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, in which we went through the backyard photographs, and we made the points we're making here. We cited Jack White's work, and also more recent studies by Judith Very Baker, who turns out herself to be very adept at conducting research. And we concluded that, in fact, the figure who had stood in for Lee Oswald was none other than Roscoe White, who was a Dallas police department officer with ties to the CIA, principally because he was the right height, weight, build, and so forth, but he had a very funny anomaly on his right wrist from having had a broken bone that didn't heal properly. Larry Rivera has taken the issue one step further by finding a photograph of Roscoe White standing in just the right posture so he could superimpose it over the Lee Oswald backyard photographs, and it's an exact fit. So it was Roscoe White to a T, so that during my presentation, I not only presented Larry's definitive work on the man in the doorway having been Lee Oswald and the figure beside him having been Billy Lovelady, but that the backyard photograph had been staged using Roscoe White to stand in for Lee, which really, I think, had a profound impact on the audience observing the evidence as it developed before their very eyes.
Well, what would you say with some concluding remarks, Jim Fetzer? You've done so much, and this particular conference has been so insightful, has it not?
Oh, it's been a terrific conference,
yes.
and there's much yet to be revealed. For example, in the latest releases, we find it turns out that the mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, had joined the CIA in 1956. It took me 10 years to figure out the connection between the CIA and Dallas, and when I discerned it was the brothers, that Earl, the mayor at the time, was a brother of Charles, who was a deputy director of the agency that JFK had dismissed. I realized that Dallas was their backyard, that they knew Dealey Plaza, the perfect location for an ambush. It turns out that another document shows that the Russians in 1965 had concluded that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy and wanted their resources to unearth all the information they could possibly about Johnson, but that had been their conclusion. And it's rather intriguing that they recently interviewed me with Paul Craig Roberts, who's our nation's leading public intellectual, for a Russian state television special about the disclosure of the documents, in which they showed special interest in the backyard photographs. So I was very gratified to see at least one government agency take a major role where, just to underline the point, the significance of the research we did, you can eliminate the candidates that have so frequently been advanced because, for example, while the KGB may have had the ability to alter photographs and films, they could not have obtained a copy of the Zapruder to subject it to massive alteration. The Mafia could not have extended its reach into Bethesda Naval Hospital to alter x-rays under control of U.S. medical officers or agents of the Secret Service. Poor anti-Castro Cubans could not have substituted someone else's brain for the brain of JFK. So when you look at the evidence and its impact on the alternative hypotheses about who was responsible, it turns out to be a very narrow and well-defined class, whereas Noel Twyman in his magisterial work, Bloody Treason, of 1997, pointing out that the most perfect conspiracy would have involved combining the resources of the CIA Mafia, which were working together against Castro, the military, the Secret Service, Lyndon Johnson, and J. Edgar Hoover, and that's exactly how it played out.
Well, so the deep state then is still a deep state now, is there?
Sad to say.
Yeah, I mean, some of those players are passed away, but I mean, the deep state is carrying on its monopoly, isn't it? Or
well, no doubt about it. Yeah, behind the scenes, which is why they've been so infuriated with Donald Trump, because he's doing his best to
he's not a player. He's a loose cannon, right?
From their point of view, he most certainly is a loose cannon. He doesn't knuckle under to everything they want. And it looks as though he may actually be achieving far more than any of us expected, with as many as 1,800 indictments having come down against the real the parties who were really involved with the Russians, which had nothing to do with Donald Trump and his campaign, but had everything to do with Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, the foundation, John Podesta, Tony Podesta, Uranium One. Remember, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were given the electric chair for sharing American nuclear secrets, atomic secrets with the Soviet Union. What about Hillary Clinton, who sold off 20% of American uranium supplies to Russia, which was approved even by Barack Hussein Obama? It's a shocking story, and more is to come. And Uranium One, though, at the time that they were receiving those approvals for the Russians to buy either the initial 19 or controlling interest later, owned two of the most productive mines in Kazakhstan.
And that's what I think the Russians were really seeking at the time that they took over Uranium One.
George, that's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I think you're more on top of that aspect of the story than am I, which is one more reason I so enjoy having these conversations with you, my friend, because I learn from you too.
Well, I don't know about that, but you're the researcher and the book writer, and I'm just a small little cog in a great big research. But I'll say this: a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, Eric Samuelson, coined the term conspiracy scholar, and you truly are the top of that group. Okay?
Oh, George, thank you. That's very kind. I appreciate that. Yes. I was once asked by WCCO, a major TV station out of Minneapolis, when I was en route to a previous conference of Judith, what I thought about the phrase conspiracy theorist and how I preferred to be described. And I said, well, I think better as conspiracy analyst or conspiracy realist, because
now the word conspiracy scholar.
I like it, George.
I mean, that elevates it to a level of scholarship.
I appreciate that, George, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jim Fetzer, for being with us this afternoon, and we certainly appreciate it, and thank you for all your hard research and your insight into these affairs.
My pleasure, George. Thanks for featuring me.
Thank you very much.